The ravens came to Dragonstone before Renly did. 3 of them, in a single morning, each bearing a different seal: the crowned stag of Storm's End, the golden rose of Highgarden, and a plain message written in Renly's own hand on expensive, rich parchment that smelled faintly of roses and ambition. Stannis Baratheon read all 3 at his war table, standing alone in the way he did everything. And when Davos Seaworth entered the chamber bearing a 4th document, the Citadel's census of troops, currently mustering at Bitterbridge, Stannis set down all the ravens and stared at the painted map of Westeros for a long time without speaking. The candles burned low. The sea crashed against Dragonstone's volcanic rock far below the window. Davos waited, as he had learned to wait, with the patience of a man who had survived starvation on Shipbreaker Bay by counting the days rather than cursing them. "He wants terms," Stannis said finally. Not a question, not surprise. The flat acknowledgement of a man receiving information he had already calculated. "He wants to meet, my lord, in person, aboard a neutral vessel in Shipbreaker Bay, if you're agreeable." Davos paused. "He's bringing Loras Tyrell as escort. No more than 20 swords." Stannis turned from the map. His jaw was tight. It was always tight. That particular grinding quality that Davos had come to read as carefully as weather. But behind the coldness, something else moved. Something that Stannis Baratheon would never name aloud, because naming it would require him to admit that it mattered. His younger brother, the boy who had grown up in this very castle while Stannis endured it, was coming home. "Tell him," Stannis said, "that I will meet him at the bay at dawn, and tell him to leave the Tyrell boy behind. I'll not negotiate with a man who brings his lover as a shield." Davos carried the message without comment. It was not his place to observe that Stannis had said negotiate rather than refuse. That single word contained more warmth than Stannis had shown toward Renly Baratheon in years. What had driven Renly to this shore was a question. The lords of the Reach were still debating, furiously at Bitterbridge, when their king rode away north with only his Kingsguard and a raven's promise. Mace Tyrell had blustered. Randyll Tarly had gone dangerously quiet in the manner of men who were already calculating the military cost of a change in strategy. It was Olenna, the Queen of Thorns, seated at the high table with her sharp eyes moving across her grandson's face like a blade testing for soft spots, who had spoken the words that cleared the room. "Let him go," she had said simply, "and let us see what he brings back." Because Olenna Tyrell had not committed 30,000 swords and the greatest granary in Westeros to the proposition of Renly Baratheon. She had committed them to the proposition of winning. And if winning required the Tyrells to back a different Baratheon, the harder one, the colder one, the one who actually had the law behind him, then Olenna Tyrell was entirely prepared to have that conversation. She simply intended to be the one who set its terms. Marjorie had watched her grandmother with the careful attention of a student who knows the lesson being taught is the most important one she'll ever receive. The meeting on Shipbreaker Bay happened at dawn as agreed. The water iron gray and cold beneath, a sky that couldn't decide between cloud and light. Renly's boat came alongside. Stannis's with the quiet efficiency of men who'd been trained on these same waters as boys. For a moment, the two brothers stood on opposite gunwales, looking at each other across 3 feet of Westerosi sea. Renly had dressed simply by his standards. No crown, the antlered helm left behind. He wore riding leathers and a green cloak that the wind pressed flat against him. And he looked, Davos thought, watching from the stern, younger than his reputation, more uncertain, more genuine than the Golden King who had laughed his way through Bitterbridge with 100,000 men at his back. Stannis looked exactly as he always looked, like a man braced for an impact he intended to survive through sheer refusal. "Brother," Renly said. "You're late," said Stannis. "The sun has been up for 6 minutes." A beat of silence. Then Renly laughed, that warm, genuine, involuntary laugh that had always been his most politically powerful weapon, the one he couldn't fake and never needed to, and crossed onto Stannis's vessel and extended his hand. Stannis looked at it for a moment, with the expression of a man being offered something he suspects is poisoned. Then he clasped it. Davos Seaworth, Onion Knight and Smuggler-turned-Lord, found himself releasing a breath he hadn't known he was holding. The terms Renly proposed were not comfortable ones. He was not. He made clear, offering submission. He was offering alliance. His name, his military relationships with the Reach Lords, his popularity in the south, and the Stormlands, these were not gifts he was laying at Stannis' feet. They were contributions to a shared enterprise, and he expected them acknowledged as such. "You want a seat at the table," Stannis said. "I want the table to exist long enough to sit at," Renly replied. "Joffrey is a bastard born of incest. We both know it. Half of King's Landing suspects it. The moment that truth is proven, publicly proven, not whispered in letters, his claim dissolves. But a whisper doesn't win wars, Stannis. Armies win wars. I have an army. You have the law. Together, you expect to be named heir." Renly met his brother's eyes steadily. "I expect to be treated as what I am. Your heir, until you produce one otherwise. Your general in the south, where men follow a warm face rather than a correct argument. Your bridge to the Tyrells, without whom your fleet has no port and your army has no grain." He paused. "I'm not asking you to like me. I'm asking you to use me. You've always been better at the second than the first." The silence stretched long enough that a gull crossed between them, crying once and was gone. "There are conditions," Stannis said. "There are always conditions with you," Renly said. "Name them." Melisandre had not been invited to the meeting on the bay. Stannis had been explicit on that point. In the particular way, he was explicit about things he expected to cause conflict. Not loudly, but with a finality that foreclosed argument. She had stood on Dragonstone's highest parapet and watched the two boats come together on the gray water, and her red lips had tightened, and she had looked into the fire she always carried with her in the small brass bowl at her belt. The flames showed her Renly's face. Warm, laughing, alive. They showed her a stag with two heads running south. They showed her, and this was the image that remained long after the others faded. A shadow on the wall of a great room, stretched long and dark, wearing a crown. But the shadow did not belong to the man she had chosen. It belonged to neither brother, or to both, or to something. That the merging of these two forces might create that the Lord of Light had not, perhaps, fully accounted for in his design. She pressed her fingers against the warm brass of the bowl and said, very quietly, in the old tongue of Ashai, "Show me the path." The flames gave her nothing else. Not yet. Below, on the gray water of Shipbreaker Bay, the two Baratheon brothers were still talking. The sun was fully up now. Somewhere to the north, in a castle of red stone and cold memory, a lion was beginning to hear rumors that would shatter his careful construction of the next 6 months. And somewhere beyond the narrow sea, a young woman with silver hair and 3 infant dragons looked west at water she had not yet crossed, unaware that the game she intended to enter was already changing shape. The ravens would fly before nightfall. The realm would know by the week's end. Stannis and Renly, the iron and the rose, the law and the warmth. The War of the Five Kings had just become a different war entirely. If you want to see more characters and scenarios reshaping the world of Westeros, hit that subscribe button and drop your wildest what if idea in the comments below. A character, a moment, a choice that history got wrong. All men must die, but legends endure. The conditions Stannis named were not cruel. That was what surprised Renly most. Not their content, but their restraint. He had prepared himself for humiliation dressed as negotiation. He had rehearsed, during the 3-day ride north from Bitterbridge, the particular way he would absorb demands without letting them show on his face. Loras had coached him. Marjorie had coached him better. Even Brienne of Tarth, his most literal-minded Kingsguard, had offered the observation that a man who expects the worst is rarely surprised into making poor decisions. What Stannis offered instead was precise, almost surgical, as though he had spent weeks, and he had, Renly realized. His brother had been calculating this possibility long before Renly had allowed himself to consider it, reducing the negotiation to its mechanical components and removing everything emotional that might contaminate the result. Renly would publicly renounce his claim to the Iron Throne and swear fealty to Stannis as the rightful king before an audience of no fewer than 50 witnesses drawn from both their retinues. Renly would retain command of the southern forces, the Reach Lords, the Stormland Bannermen, who had followed him rather than Stannis, but would operate under Stannis' strategic authority. He would be General of the South, not a king, not a co-ruler, a commander. The Tyrell alliance would be formalized through the small council, not through marriage. Stannis said this without inflection, but Renly understood precisely what it meant. Marjorie Tyrell would not be queen. Whatever the Tyrells had imagined purchasing with 30,000 swords, a crown for their rose was not on the table. And finally, the condition that landed softest and cut deepest. Renly would dismiss Melisandre from any formal role in the unified campaign, not banish her, not name her enemy, simply exclude her from councils of war and decisions of state. Stannis said this last condition looking not at Renly, but at some middle distance above his brother's left shoulder. And Renly understood then that this was the condition that had cost Stannis the most to formulate, not because he doubted it, because he suspected what it would cost him with her. Agreed, Renly said, before Stannis could reconsider. His brother's eyes snapped to his face. For just a moment, barely long enough to name. Something that might have been relief moved through Stannis Baratheon's expression like a ship passing through fog. Agreed, Stannis repeated, as though testing the word's weight. They clasped hands again. The gray water moved beneath them. Somewhere above Dragonstone, a raven lifted from the rookery and flew west, carrying the first whisper of what was coming to a castle that would not be ready for it. The swearing of fealty happened 3 days later in Dragonstone's great hall, which smelled of salt and old stone and the particular cold that volcanic rock holds, regardless of season. 53 witnesses gathered, lords, knights, captains, and maesters drawn equally from both retinues. A number Davos had spent 2 days negotiating, with Renly's steward with the focused intensity of a man building a ship in a bottle. Renly knelt on Dragonstone's blackstone floor and spoke the words, clearly and without performance, which was the most surprising thing he had done since arriving. Those who knew him had expected some quality of theater, some warmth deployed to soften the hard edges of submission. Instead, he knelt with his back straight and his voice level, and his eyes on his brother's face. And the words I, Renly of House Baratheon, renounce all claim to the Iron Throne of the Seven Kingdoms, and swear my sword, my name, and my allegiance to Stannis, first of his name, rightful king of the Undulls, the Rhoynar, and the First. Men came out of him like something he had decided rather than something he was performing. Loras Tyrell, standing at the rear of the gathered witnesses, with his jaw set and his knuckles white on his sword belt, looked like a man watching something he loved being altered into, something he didn't recognize. Brienne of Tarth watched Renly with an expression of careful evaluation, as though recalculating the man she had sworn to protect against a new set of variables. Stannis said the words of acceptance. He did not smile. He never smiled. But when he reached down and took Renly's arm to raise him, the grip lasted a beat longer than ceremony required. Davos caught Maester Cressen's replacement, a young maester named Pylus, who had arrived from the Citadel only months before, writing furiously in a leather-bound journal, and thought, whatever else this is, it will be recorded. The Tyrell response arrived before the ink was dry on the fealty document, not from Mace Tyrell, whose letters were always long and self-congratulatory and ultimately empty. From Olenna, her raven came on the second morning after the ceremony, a single sheet of parchment bearing the golden rose seal, and the message was 9 words long. We require a conversation. I will come to you. Stannis read it twice. Then he handed it to Davos with the expression of a man being told the tide was coming in. She's testing whether I'll receive her, he said. She's coming whether you receive her or not. Davos replied carefully. That's rather the point of the message, I think. She wants to negotiate the terms of the Tyrell commitment directly, without Renly as intermediary. Yes, my lord. Stannis was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, the sea moved in its eternal, indifferent rhythm against the black rocks. She's good, he said, in a tone that contained neither admiration nor resentment, simply the assessment of a man who respected competence wherever it appeared, even when it was inconvenient. One of the best in the realm, Davos agreed. Send the raven. Tell her she is welcome at Dragonstone. He paused. And Davos, tell Melisandre that the lady Olenna's visit is a matter of military logistics, and she need not attend the reception. Davos kept his face neutral. They both understood what was actually being said. Keep the Red Woman away from the Tyrell. Matriarch before either of them decides. The other is a problem that needs solving. What Stannis had not told Renly, what he had told no one, including Davos, in the direct terms that the situation probably warranted, was that Melisandre had come to him the night before Renly's boat arrived in the bay and told him what she had seen in the flames. She had described a great battle, a darkness from the north more absolute than any war between kings. She had described, and here her voice had taken on the particular quality that Stannis had learned to distinguish from her ordinary certainty, a quality that was quieter and more focused and therefore more disturbing, a moment in that battle where the difference between victory and annihilation rested on how many swords answered the call. You need the numbers, she had said, not because the Lord of Light requires them, because the enemy does not tire and does not feel cold, and does not stop when the sun rises. You need every sword in the south behind you, before you can face what comes from the north. Stannis had asked her if this meant Renly should live. She had been silent for a long time. The flames between them had moved in ways that fire did not naturally move. The Lord of Light's path is not always the straight one, she had said finally. And then, what matters is that you reach the destination. He had read it as reluctant permission. He suspected, lying awake in the hours before dawn listening to Dragonstone breathe around him, that it was considerably more complicated than that. Melisandre did not grant permission. She read futures and shaped the decisions of men toward ends that Renly, apparently, approved of. If she had told him this, if she had spoken of the northern darkness on the very eve of Renly's arrival, then she had done so because she believed his choice to meet his brother would lead through paths she could trace in fire and he could not see at all, toward the confrontation in the north that she had always told him was his true purpose. He was meant to be king, but perhaps, he was meant to be king with his brothers' swords behind him. He did not find this comforting. He found it characteristically correct. Renly, for his part, spent the days after the ceremony rewriting letters to every Reach Lord in his retinue, carefully calibrating. The message between this was my choice freely made, and the strategic reality demanded it without allowing either explanation to undermine the other. It was the most politically delicate correspondence he had ever composed, and he was composing it without Marjorie's counsel, which he felt acutely. Loras found him at the writing table on the third night, surrounded by discarded drafts, and said nothing for a while, just stood in the doorway of the small chamber Dragonstone had provided, austere, cold, nothing like the silks and warmth of the Reach, and watched his king write. You could have taken King's Landing, Loras said finally. Not accusation, just fact. Perhaps, Renly said without looking up. And then what? Stannis would have fought me. I'd have spent everything I had crushing a man with. A better claim than mine. And when I finally sat the throne, if I sat it, I'd have sat it on a foundation of killed brothers and broken law, with half the realm unconvinced. And the Lannisters, regrouping, and whatever is coming from the north still coming. He set down his quill. I made the right choice. I know, Loras said quietly. I just wanted you to know that I know you know what you gave up. Renly looked at him then. Something passed between them that the cold room held in its volcanic walls long after they had both gone to sleep. Outside Dragonstone, the sea moved in the dark. In King's Landing, a lion was sharpening his claws, and in the halls of the castle itself, in a room lit only by the flames she always kept burning, a red woman sat very still and looked into a fire that showed her things she had not yet decided whether to share. The news reached King's Landing on a Wednesday, carried by 3 separate ravens from 3 separate sources, which was how Varys preferred important information to arrive, redundancy as verification, confirmation as armor against manipulation. He read all 3 messages before the first candle of morning had burned, down to its second mark, sitting in his chambers in the small hours with his bald head bowed and his soft hands folded in his expression doing the thing it did when he was genuinely surprised, which was to show nothing at all with unusual intensity. He had known Renly might negotiate. He had not calculated that Renly would kneel. The distinction mattered enormously. A negotiation between the Baratheon brothers, terms traded, positions staked, the whole process dragging out over weeks while Joffrey sat the throne and Tywin Lannister continued fortifying his position, was a manageable variable. It was the kind of political complexity that Varys had spent 30 years learning to navigate, redirect, and occasionally accelerate when acceleration served the realm. But Renly on his knees before Stannis. Renly with his claim formally surrendered and 53 witnesses to prove it. Renly's 100,000 swords pointed at King's Landing under a single, unified command rather than divided between two proud brothers who couldn't share a room without competing. That was not a variable. That was a wall. He dressed carefully, chose his most neutral robe, and went to find Tyrion Lannister before the rest of the castle woke up. Tyrion was already awake. He was, in Varys's experience, almost always already awake, which was one of the qualities that made him simultaneously the most useful and most dangerous Lannister. He sat in the Tower of the Hand's small solar, with a cup of wine he had not yet touched, and a map of Westeros spread before him, and the particular stillness of a very intelligent man who has just received information that requires him to rebuild his entire understanding of the next 6 months, from the foundation upward. "You've heard," Varys said. An hour ago. Tyrion did not look up from the map. "Sit down. Don't offer me wisdom yet. I'm still in the part where I'm furious." Varys sat. He watched Tyrion's finger trace the road south from Dragonstone to King's Landing, then move west along the Rose Road toward Highgarden, then tap once, twice, 3 times on the point where those roads converged, approximately 40 miles south of the city. "How many?" Tyrion asked. "Combined? If the Tyrells commit fully?" Varys paused, not for effect, but because the number genuinely required framing. "Somewhere between 80 and 100,000, plus Stannis' fleet, plus whatever the Stormland lords add when they consolidate." Tyrion picked up his wine, put it down without drinking. "Our walls are good. Our gold is good. Our wildfire is..." He stopped. "How much wildfire do we actually have?" "Haleen believes enough to destroy half the fleet in the bay. Should it come to that?" "Should it come to that?" Tyrion repeated, with the tone of a man examining a very thin rope. "He may shortly need to cross a very deep gorge." He finally looked up. "Where is my father?" "Harrenhal, moving toward the city but not yet arrived. He received the news approximately 2 hours before we did," his informant in. "Renly's retinue is faster than mine, which I find professionally irritating." Varys allowed the faintest smile. "He will be here within the fortnight, I expect. Faster if he pushes the march." "Does he know about the Tyrells?" "He knows Renly has bent the knee. He will have calculated the Tyrell question himself." "Your father is." "I know what my father is." Tyrion stood, which required him to step around the table in the cramped solar, and went to the window. Dawn was beginning to suggest itself over the city's rooftops, gray and reluctant. Below in the streets, the first bakers and fishmongers were moving, carrying the day's first burdens through the narrow ways, entirely unaware that the political architecture above their heads had just shifted on its foundations. "Cersei will panic," he said, "which means Joffrey will be insufferable, because he feeds on her panic and amplifies it into cruelty, which means someone in the court, probably 2 or 3, someone's will do something catastrophically stupid in the next fortnight, trying to demonstrate loyalty or solve the problem without being asked to." "Almost certainly," Varys agreed, "which means I need to be hand in fact and not just in name before my father arrives." Tyrion turned from the window. His mismatched eyes had that quality they sometimes had, the focused, slightly dangerous quality that appeared when he had moved past fury into something colder and more useful. "What does Stannis want, Varys?" "Not the throne. Obviously the throne. But what does he actually want? What does the man wake up in the night worrying about?" Varys considered this with genuine care. "Justice," he said finally. "He wants the record corrected. He wants the realm to acknowledge that Joffrey is a bastard born of incest and that the succession was stolen from him. He would accept a clean transfer, Joffrey removed, his claim recognized, the law observed, over a war. If such a transfer were possible. It's not possible. Cersei will burn the city before she lets Joffrey be named bastard publicly. Yes, so we fight. Unless," Varys said carefully, "someone were to find a way to separate the Tyrell commitment from the Baratheon cause before the armies reach our walls. The Tyrells want a queen. Stannis has told them Marjorie will not have the crown. If that wound could be opened further, Tyrion said, you want to peel the Tyrells away from Stannis. I want to present the possibility to you as a strategic option worth considering. Tyrion was quiet for a moment. Then he picked up his wine and finally drank, and set the cup down with a click of pewter on wood. Give me a meeting with Littlefinger. And Varys, he paused. Don't tell my sister about this conversation. Varys rose, smoothing his robe. My lord Hand, he said pleasantly, I never tell your sister anything she doesn't already suspect. It simply makes her feel better informed than she is, which is, I find, the safest way to manage her. He left before Tyrion could decide whether that was reassuring. Cersei had received the news the previous evening, from a source Varys had not yet identified, which meant Littlefinger had a faster bird somewhere in Renly's household than either of them, which was a problem for another morning. She had summoned her council at midnight, Joffrey included, dragged from his chambers in a state of adolescent outrage that had curdled, under the pressure of real information, into something more genuinely frightened. And the meeting had been exactly as useful as Tyrion had predicted it would be. Joffrey had demanded an immediate military response. He had used the phrase crush them where they stand twice. The second time with the emphasis of someone who believes repetition constitutes strategy. Cersei had spent 20 minutes attempting to transmit through maternal telepathy the message, be quiet. You are making this worse, and had failed completely. Grand Maester Pycelle had offered a historical precedent for brother against brother, succession conflicts that had been neither accurate nor relevant. And Ser Marentrant had stood by the door looking decoratively useless in the way that the Kingsguard had perfected under Joffrey's reign. It was Littlefinger who had said the thing that actually mattered, in the voice he used when he wanted to sound helpful rather than ambitious, which was the most dangerous version of Peter Baelish that existed. The Tyrells, he had said, from his position at the table's corner, have not yet formally committed their forces to the Baratheon cause. A letter of fealty between brothers is one thing. 30,000 reach, swords on the march, is another. There is, I believe, still time to have a conversation with Highgarden about what they truly want, and whether Stannis Baratheon is really positioned to give it to them. Cersei had looked at him with the sharp attention she gave to things she simultaneously distrusted and needed. What would that conversation require? She had asked. Littlefinger had smiled the smile he always smiled, when he was already 6 moves ahead. A marriageable king, he had said, in a very carefully worded letter to Lady Olenna. In the small hours after the council dispersed, Littlefinger stood at his own window in the tower of the small council and looked out at the same gray city. Tyrion would observe from the Tower of the Hand 2 hours later, and thought about ladders. The chaos created by 2 Baratheon brothers united was, objectively, terrible for Peter Baelish's plans. He had spent years cultivating the conditions for precisely this kind of fracture, rival claimants, divided loyalties, the realm's attention scattered across 5 different kings so that no single center of gravity could form and hold. Unity was his enemy. Unity meant order. Order meant accountable power. Accountable power meant that men like Littlefinger, who thrived in the gaps between powers rather than under any single one, found their room to maneuver compressed to nothing. He needed the Tyrells to leave, or he needed Stannis to do something that drove them away. Or, and this was the thought he was turning over as the city breathed its pre-dawn breath below him, he needed to find what Stannis valued more than the Tyrell alliance, and use that thing as a lever. He thought about the Red Woman. He thought about Stannis' rigid theology, his newly acquired faith in R'hllor, his dependency on Melisandre's counsel. He thought about what a man like Stannis would do if he believed, truly believed, with evidence, that the Tyrell alliance was poisoning his relationship with his god. Who better to deliver that message, Littlefinger thought, than the woman herself? He needed to find someone who could reach Melisandre with the right information, framed in the right way, at the right moment. Someone she would trust. Someone whose interests could be made to align with his, at least temporarily, at least long enough. He was still working out the details when the city's first bells began to ring and the ravens started flying south from Dragonstone, carrying the news of a united Baratheon host to every lord between the Blackwater and the Dornish marches. The game had changed shape. Littlefinger, characteristically, was already changing with it. Tywin Lannister received the consolidated intelligence report on the Baratheon unification the same morning. His outriders brought him confirmation that the Tyrells had not yet broken camp at Bitterbridge. He read it on horseback, which was how he preferred to receive information that required immediate strategic response, movement as thinking, the rhythm of the march as a kind of discipline that prevented emotional reaction from contaminating analytical clarity. He read it twice, folded it, handed it back to his maester without expression. Then he rode in silence for 2 hours while his army moved through the Westerlands toward the Gold Road, and the ravens from Renly found him at midday, camp with 4 additional confirmations from sources embedded in Dragonstone's household, Renly's former retinue, and 2 Reach Lords whose relationship with House Lannister predated their relationship with House Tyrell by several generations. The picture assembled itself with the cold precision that Tywin's mind applied to all problems, stripping sentiment, stripping noise, reducing the situation to its essential mechanical components. Stannis Baratheon with Renly's forces unified behind him commanded the largest single military post in Westeros at this moment, larger than the Lannister armies currently divided between the Westerlands, Renly, and the capital, larger than Robb Stark's northern force, which remained an acute problem in its own right and could not be simply abandoned, while the southern threat materialized, larger than anything Joffrey could field from the Crownlands alone. The combined Baratheon host, if the Tyrells committed fully, was not a force that could be defeated in open battle with what Tywin currently had available. This was not a conclusion that distressed him. Tywin Lannister was not distressed by problems. He was interested in them. Distress was for men who hadn't prepared contingencies, and Tywin had spent 40 years ensuring that he always had contingencies. The question was which contingency this situation required. He pushed the march. They reached King's Landing 11 days later, faster than anyone had expected. The Lannister forces moving through the Gold Road's autumn mud with the focused urgency of an army that understood its commander's silences. Tywin rode through the city gates without ceremony, sent a single raven to the Tower of the Hand announcing his arrival, and was in the small council chamber before the dust of the march had settled from his cloak. Tyrion was waiting. So were Varys, Littlefinger, Pycelle, and Cersei, the last of whom had arranged herself at the table's head in the chair that technically belonged to the king and practically belonged, in these circumstances, to whoever arrived earliest and sat down with the most authority. She had managed, Tyrion observed, to look simultaneously relieved by her father's arrival and resentful of it, which was an impressive emotional achievement. Tywin sat down without greeting anyone, poured himself water from the table's carafe, and said, "The Tyrell commitment is not finalized." It was not a question. He was confirming intelligence against the room's knowledge, calibrating. "Lady Olenna is traveling to Dragonstone," Tyrion said. "She left Bitterbridge 4 days ago. Her personal retinue. No significant military escort. She's negotiating directly with Stannis." Tywin was quiet for a moment, turning his cup. What does she want? What she's always wanted. A Tyrell on the throne, or close enough to it that the distinction doesn't matter. Margaery as queen, or Willis as master of ships, or Loras in the Kingsguard at minimum, some formal acknowledgement that 30,000 swords purchased a permanent position at the center of power rather than a grateful nod from a king who'll forget the debt the moment he's crowned. Tyrion paused. Stannis has refused the marriage. He won't give her the crown for Margaery. Then she hasn't committed yet, Cersei said. The relief in her voice was almost painful in its visibility. She hasn't committed yet, Tyrion confirmed. But she will, unless we give her a reason not to. A better offer. Something Stannis can't or won't match. The room turned, almost physically, toward Tywin, who was already, Tyrion could see, 3 steps ahead of the conversation they were having, running the calculation that would produce the answer before anyone else had finished formulating the question. "Joffrey will marry Margaery Tyrell," Tywin said. Cersei went very still. "The betrothal to the Stark girl is dissolved. Sansa Stark is worth nothing to us. Now her brother is our enemy and her value as political currency has expired. Marjorie Tyrell is worth 30,000 swords and the Reach's grain supply. The marriage is announced before Olenna reaches Dragonstone. He looked at Cersei with the particular expression he used when he was not asking for agreement, merely informing her of decisions already made. Olenna's raven turns around in the middle of the Blackwater rush when she learns her granddaughter is to be queen. Stannis will still have Renly, Cersei said. Stannis, without the Tyrells, has perhaps 60,000 men against our combined forces once I recall the Westerlands armies and Mace Tyrell, relieved of his mother's strategic direction, contributes his own confused loyalty to whichever side his daughter is marrying into. Tywin set down his cup. A war we can win. A war against a unified Baratheon Tyrell host we cannot. Not quickly. Not without costs that would cripple us for a generation. Littlefinger, who had been silent with the quality of silence that meant he was absorbing intelligence rather than waiting to speak, said, "There is the question of Lady Olenna herself. She is not Mace. She will not simply redirect her allegiance because a marriage offer arrives. She'll want to see the offer, evaluate it against Stannis' alternative, and make the choice that maximizes Tyrell power regardless of which king benefits. Which is why," Tywin said, looking at Littlefinger with the careful attention he reserved for men whose intelligence he respected and whose loyalty he did not trust, "you will carry the offer to her personally, on the road, before she reaches Dragonstone." The silence that followed had several textures. Tyrion's was the silence of a man recalibrating his assessment of his father's speed. Varys's was the silence of someone storing information for later use. Littlefinger's was the silence of a man who has just been handed an assignment that simultaneously serves his principal's interests and his own, and is deciding how to be pleased about this without appearing too pleased. "I'm honored by the trust," Littlefinger said. "I'm not asking you to be honored," Tywin said. "I'm asking you to ride fast and speak convincingly. Can you do both? I've built a career on it." What no one at the small council table knew. What Varys suspected but had not yet confirmed. What Littlefinger was beginning to piece together from fragments was that Olenna Tyrell had already received a letter from Dragonstone. Not from Stannis, not through official channels, from Melisandre. The letter had arrived 2 days before Olenna left Bitterbridge, carried not by Raven but by a personal messenger, a young woman in a red dress who spoke High Valyrian and Reach Common tongue with equal fluency, and who had given no name and accepted no hospitality and left before dawn, having delivered only the sealed letter and the verbal message that the Lord of Light sees the rose and finds it neither ash nor kindling, but something rarer, a root that survives all burning. Olenna had read the letter 3 times. She had shown it to no one, not even Marjorie. She had placed it in the brass-bound chest where she kept documents she considered both important and dangerous, and she had ordered the camp struck and the journey to Dragonstone begun, and she had sat in her wheelhouse for 4 days, thinking about what a Red Priestess wanted with the Queen of Thorns badly, enough to write to her directly and in secret. The letter contained no threats, no prophecy, no mystical language designed to impress credulous lords with R'hllor's supposed omniscience. It contained, instead, a remarkably specific piece of political intelligence about what Tywin Lannister was planning to do with his daughter's betrothal, and a single question that Melisandre had apparently considered worth a private letter to the most dangerous grandmother in Westeros. "When the lions offer you the rose crown, Lady Olenna, ask yourself what they intend to do with the thorns." Olenna's wheelhouse rolled on through the Blackwater Rush's muddy roads, and she tapped one gnarled finger against the arm of her cushioned seat and thought about thorns and lions and a red woman on a volcanic island who apparently knew things she shouldn't and shared them for reasons that Olenna had not yet deciphered. She was looking forward to Dragonstone with an intensity she hadn't felt about a destination in years. In Winterfell, cold and gray and entirely focused on its own war, Robb Stark received his own raven about the Baratheon unification and sat very still in his great chair while his lords argued around him. His mother Catelyn, present and watching his face, saw something in his expression that she recognized from his father and found, in this moment, both comforting and frightening. It was the expression of a man doing a calculation that kept producing the same answer, an answer that cost more than he wanted to pay. If Stannis takes the throne, one of his bannermen said, our war becomes unnecessary. Joffrey is gone. The succession is resolved. We swore independence, another cut in. The North remembers. We don't bend the knee to any Baratheon. We bent the knee before. For 300 years we. Enough, Robb said quietly. The room silenced itself, because his quiet voice had started carrying that quality recently, the quality his fathers had carried, the quality that made men stop arguing and start listening. Send a raven to Stannis. No terms, no submission. An offer to discuss the North's position if and when he sits the throne. He paused. And send one to my uncle Edmure. I need the Riverlands to hold while I think. Catelyn watched her son and thought about Ned. About how Ned had always done the right thing, and what the right thing had cost him. She hoped, with a fierceness that surprised her, that Robb had inherited enough of his father's honor and enough of something else. Something harder. Something more Tully perhaps, to survive the difference. Olenna Tyrell arrived at Dragonstone on a morning that couldn't decide between rain and fog and had settled, compromisingly, on both. Her wheelhouse rolled onto the dock with the particular authority of a vehicle that had traveled very far and expected to be received appropriately, and the woman who descended from it, small, sharp-eyed, wrapped in a traveling cloak that had seen better roads and didn't care, looked up at Dragonstone's volcanic towers with the expression of someone evaluating a property they might purchase and finding it structurally sound but aesthetically catastrophic. Grim place, she said to no one in particular. I can see why the man turned to religion. Renly met her on the dock, which had been his suggestion and Stannis' concession, on the grounds that Olenna knew Renly and would be marginally less likely to open the negotiation with an offensive observation if she was greeted by a familiar face. Stannis had agreed with the logic while making clear that he found it irritating, which Renly had decided to count as progress. Lady Olenna. He offered his arm. Welcome to Dragonstone. She took his arm with the practiced ease of a woman who accepted assistance without requiring it, and said, you look surprisingly well for a man who just gave away a kingdom. I gave away a claim, Renly said. There's a distinction. There is, she agreed pleasantly, though I find that men who make it tend to be either very wise or very good at believing comfortable things. I haven't yet decided which you are. She patted his arm. Walk me inside before I drown, and tell me whether the kitchens here are as terrible as the architecture suggests. The formal negotiation was scheduled for the following morning. What happened the evening before was, in many ways, more consequential. Stannis received Olenna alone in his solar. No Renly, no Davos, no Maester. A concession to her explicitly stated preference for conversations. That didn't require performance for an audience. She sat across his war table from him with a cup of Dragonstones, indifferent wine, and looked at him with the direct assessment of a woman who had outlived 5 kings and intended to outlive several more, and said, I received an interesting letter before I left Bitterbridge. From your Red Woman. Stannis' jaw tightened by precisely the degree that Olenna had learned from 30 years of reading powerful men across tables, indicated genuine surprise being compressed into controlled response. Melisandre wrote to you. She did. Without your knowledge, I assume. Given your face just now. Olenna set down her cup. She told me that Tywin Lannister was planning to offer Marjorie to Joffrey. She was correct. Lord Littlefinger intercepted my party on the Blackwater Road 2 days ago with precisely that offer. She watched Stannis' face. I declined, in case you were wondering. Why? Stannis asked. Blunt as always. No diplomatic cushioning around the question. Because Joffrey is a vicious, unstable child who will be dead within 5 years by someone's hand if not his own impulses. And the crown he wears belongs to you by law. And I did not march 30,000 men from Highgarden to back a losing claim, dressed in a winning smile. She picked up her wine again. I backed Renly because Renly was popular and warm and the realm would have loved him. I was wrong about whether that was enough. You are cold and rigid and the realm will not love you. And you have the law and your brother's army and you are going to win. These are the actual relevant facts. The silence that followed was the particular silence of Stannis. Baratheon receiving a compliment that had been constructed entirely from observations he would himself have described as criticisms. The Tyrell commitment, he said. Full, Olenna said. 30,000 swords, the Reach's grain stores. The Red Wine fleet to reinforce yours. Mace will bluster about terms and Randall. Tarly will want a military command which you should give him because he's actually competent, unlike my son. She set down her cup with a precise click. In exchange, Stannis repeated. Willis as master of ships once you sit the throne. Garland given a lordship in whatever crownlands you redistribute after the Lannister's inevitable attainder. And Loras in your Kingsguard, his choice. Before you object, he'll want it. She paused. In a conversation about Marjorie, I told Renly. You told Renly she wouldn't be queen. I'm not asking for queen. Olenna's eyes were sharp as Valyrian, steel and considerably older. I'm asking for lady. A position at court. A role that acknowledges the Tyrell contribution without threatening your succession. Marjorie is 19 and clever and has been trained since childhood for exactly this kind of court. She will be useful to you, Stannis, in ways that your particular personality, admirable, rigid, and socially catastrophic, genuinely requires. Stannis looked at her for a long moment. You want her close to power without the title. I want her where her abilities are used rather than wasted. The title can wait for the next generation. Olenna smiled, which was not a warm expression but was a precise one. I am, above all things, practical. Melisandre's letter, Stannis said. Why did she write to you? Olenna considered him. I suspect, she said carefully, because she is a great deal more sophisticated than her theology suggests, and she understood that the Lannister offer would reach me before you could counter it, through official channels, and she made a calculation about what serves the Lord of Light's purposes, your victory, that required her to act independently of your authority. She paused. I found it interesting. I also found it concerning. Why concerning? Because a woman who acts independently of her king's authority, when she believes her God requires it, will always be capable of acting independently of her king's authority. That is a useful quality in an advisor and a dangerous one in a power. She stood, slowly, with the care of old bones and undiminished dignity. I'll take your answer in the morning. Get some sleep, Your Grace. You look like a man who hasn't slept properly since. Robert sat the throne. She left. Stannis sat alone in his solar for a long time, looking at nothing. The morning negotiation lasted 4 hours and produced a document that Pylus copied in his most careful hand and that both parties signed, without visible satisfaction, which Davos privately considered the best evidence that it was a fair agreement. Renly witnessed it. Loras, present at last after 2 days of pointed exclusion, read the Kingsguard provision with the expression of a man receiving something he had wanted for so long that receiving it felt unreal. Randyll Tarly's military command was the provision that generated the most discussion. Stannis wanted him commanding the van. Olenna wanted him commanding the right flank, where the heaviest fighting would concentrate, and where his particular tactical gifts, aggressive, disciplined, relentless, would be most effectively deployed. They compromised on joint van command with Ser Gaiard Morrigan, which satisfied neither party and would therefore, Davos thought, probably work. What was not in the document, and what therefore mattered most, was the understanding that moved beneath the formal language like a current beneath ice. Olenna Tyrell was not swearing to Stannis Baratheon in the way that Renly had sworn. She was entering a transaction, a partnership of interests. She would deliver her part as long as Stannis delivered his, and not a day longer. And both of them understood this with a clarity that made the written terms almost decorative. Stannis found this arrangement offensive on principle and acceptable in practice. Olenna found it refreshingly honest compared to the warm performances of loyalty she had received from men who betrayed each other over dinner. Melisandre had watched the negotiations' conclusion from the upper gallery, not invited, not excluded, present in the way that she was always present at Dragonstone, which was to say everywhere and nowhere, a red thread woven through the castle's daily life that everyone noticed and no one could quite locate. She had watched Olenna sign the document and had felt not satisfaction exactly, but the particular quality of rightness that she associated with the Lord of Light's design unfolding as it should. She had not told Stannis about the letter. She had known, when she wrote it, that she would eventually need to tell him. Olenna had made that inevitable by mentioning it directly, which Melisandre had calculated as a 60% probability and had decided was an acceptable risk. The more important probability, the one she had been optimizing for, was the Tyrell commitment. Without it, Stannis could not take King's Landing quickly enough. Without King's Landing taken quickly, the war in the south would drag through winter, consuming the armies that were needed, desperately, existentially needed, for what came after. She had seen enough in the flames to know that the Long Night did not care about the timing of southern political negotiations. What she had not expected, what she was still turning over in the privacy of her own council, in the hours when the flames showed her things she had not asked to see, was the vision that had come 3 nights before Olenna's arrival. Not of the south, not of King's Landing or dragons or the Iron Throne's cold blades. Of the wall, of blue eyes moving through darkness in numbers that made the Baratheon Tyrell host look like a village militia, of a night that did not end when the sun should have risen. She had burned that vision down to ash in her brass bowl and said nothing. There would be time. There had to be time. The Lord of Light did not show his champion the true war only to deny him the means to fight it. The South had to be resolved first. The throne had to be won. The armies had to be turned north before the blue eyes reached the wall's southern face. First the throne, she told herself. Then the dawn. She watched Olenna Tyrell leave the negotiation chamber and felt the cold that had nothing to do with Dragonstone's volcanic stone settle in her chest like a fist of ice, and said nothing, and smiled her red smile at the maester who passed her in the hall, and went back to her fires. Outside, the unified host was already beginning to form. Ravens flew south. Lords received their orders. The greatest army assembled in Westeros since Aegon's conquest began its slow, inevitable turn toward King's Landing, and in the north, beyond the wall's ancient ice, something that had been patient for 8,000 years, felt the convergence of human power in the south and recognized, with the alien intelligence of things that do not die, that the distraction it had been waiting for was finally, beautifully complete. The march south began on a Tuesday, which Stannis noted in his war journal with the same flat precision he applied to everything, and which Renly noted by riding the length of the forming column at a canter and returning to the van with his cheeks red from the cold and something in his expression that Davos, watching from horseback, recognized as the particular aliveness of a man who has found the thing he is genuinely good at and been given permission to do it. Renly was a superb battlefield commander. This was the quality that his political charm had always overshadowed in popular estimation, because warmth was easier to see than tactical intelligence, and crowds remembered the laugh before they remembered the deployment. But Randyll Tarly, riding the right flank with the focused economy of a man who respected only demonstrated competence, had watched Renly organize the columns, order of march for 40 minutes, and then said to his adjutant, in a voice carefully pitched below hearing range, "He's good," which from Randyll Tarly was the equivalent of anyone else constructing a monument. The army moved in 3 divisions. Stannis commanded the center, his original Dragonstone forces, the bulk of the fleet operating in parallel along the coast. The stone-faced discipline of men who had drilled under his eye for years, and moved with the unhurried precision of soldiers who understood that their commanders' expectations were both absolute and achievable. Renly commanded the Southern Division, the Stormland Knights, the Reach Cavalry, the mercenary companies that had attached themselves to his banner during the Bitterbridge Assembly, all of them moving with the particular energy of forces that believed they were winning and had decided to make that belief self-fulfilling. Randyll Tarly commanded the right with the Tyrell Infantry, which was the largest single component of the army and the most professionally trained, and he drove them at a pace that had his subordinate lords quietly furious and his soldiers quietly proud. The column stretched 12 miles on a good road. On the road south of the Blackwater Rush, which were not good roads, it stretched 14. Tyrion Lannister watched it coming through the reports that arrived daily by Raven. each one more precise than the last as his informants in the advancing host found, their courage inversely proportional to their distance from King's Landing. He mapped the march on the table, in the Tower of the Hand with small painted figures that he moved each morning with the ritualistic care of a man who understood that the figures were not the reality, and that understanding, their inadequacy, was itself a form of intelligence. They'll reach the Blackwater in 12 days, he told Bronn, who was sharpening a knife on the windowsill with the philosophical contentment of a man who had long ago made peace with the likelihood of violence and was simply maintaining his equipment in the meantime. 12 days, Bronn repeated. Right. So we've got 11 days to make this city survivable and 1 day to panic. We've got 11 days to execute a defense that has perhaps a 40% chance of working under optimal conditions, which these are not. Tyrion moved a figure, the chain across the Blackwater rush. Is it ready? Harry Hal says another 3 days for the final links. Tell Harry Hal he has too. Harry Hal won't like that. Harry Hal is not the one who has to explain to 100,000 advancing soldiers why the chain isn't across the river. Bronn considered this. Fair point. He went back to his knife. The wildfire was the variable that Tyrion returned to in his calculations, with the obsessive frequency of a man who knows that his only real advantage is also his most unstable one. Haleen had confirmed the numbers 3 times. Now, 782 jars of the substance cached in the cellars beneath the Red Keep and in 3 locations along the riverbank, each cache positioned to maximize the dispersal pattern when ignited. The alchemist had explained the chemistry with the trembling enthusiasm of a man describing his life's work to someone who might actually use it, and Tyrion had listened carefully and asked the precise questions that revealed him to be the only member of the small council who had genuinely done the reading. The chain would close the river. The wildfire would do what wildfire did, and then it would be swords and walls. And the question of whether King's Landing's defenses were good enough to hold until Tywin arrived from the east with the Westerland's forces, 40%, perhaps 45% on a good day, if the wind cooperated and Stannis' fleet commanders made the specific tactical error that Tyrion's plan required them to make. He did not share these odds with Cersei, who was operating on the assumption that their father's arrival would solve everything and had therefore directed her considerable intelligence entirely toward palace politics rather than military preparation. He did not share them with Joffrey, who had decided that the coming battle was primarily an opportunity for personal glory and had been fitted for decorative armor by 3 different smiths. He shared them in the privacy of his own council, with Varys alone in the deep hours of the night when the Tower of the Hand was quiet and the city below them made its restless sleeping sounds. If the chain holds and the wildfire deploys as planned, Varys said, on one of these nights, and Tywin arrives within the window, 40%, Tyrion said, and if any one of those elements fails, less. Varys was quiet for a moment. I have been in this city through 3 kings and 2 sieges, he said finally. I have seen it survive things that should have destroyed it and fail to survive. Things that seem manageable. The city itself is resilient in the way that things built by desperate people on uncertain ground tend to be resilient. It absorbs disaster rather than resisting it. That's a very philosophical way of saying we might all die, Tyrion said. I find philosophy useful in circumstances where practical alternatives are limited. Varys rose. The plan is good. My Lord Hand, better than any other hand, would have constructed with these resources in this timeline. He paused at the door. Whatever happens at the Blackwater, the history of this city will remember that you tried. History, Tyrion said, is written by whoever survives. The Battle of the Blackwater Rush began on a night of no moon, which was Stannis' choice and a good one. His fleet moving up the river in the darkness with muffled oars, the torches on King's Landing's walls providing orientation without illumination. The city's lights a warm smear on the Blackwater that the fleet navigated toward, with the grim efficiency of men who had been told exactly what to expect and believed their commander implicitly. What they had not been told to expect was the single ship moving against them. It came out of the darkness upriver, unmanned as far as anyone on the lead vessels could determine, drifting with the current. And the first indication of what it was came not from sight, but from smell, the sharp, strange, chemical sweetness of wildfire that spread across the water like a rumor ahead of the reality. And by the time Stannis' fleet commanders understood what they were seeing, the ship was among them and the water around it had taken on the green luminescence that preceded. The explosion did not sound like an explosion. It sounded like the world clearing its throat. The green light was visible from Dragonstone. It was visible from the Kingswood. It was visible, later reported by shocked and sleepless small folk, from villages 20 miles from the river. It turned the Blackwater rush into something that was briefly, terribly beautiful, a corridor of emerald fire that consumed 24 ships in the first 30 seconds and spread to a dozen more in the following minute as the wildfire found the oil-soaked timbers of vessels packed too closely together to escape the burning. Tyrion watched it from the city walls with his mouth open. The chain rose from the river bottom behind the burning fleet, pulled taut by the mechanism he had spent 6 weeks building and 3 nights praying would function. And the surviving ships of Stannis' fleet found themselves enclosed, burning ahead, iron chain behind, the riverbanks suddenly alive with Lannister crossbowmen who had been waiting in the darkness for precisely this moment. It was, by any military measure, a catastrophic opening exchange for the attacking force. Stannis received the news of the fleet's destruction with the stillness of a man absorbing a blow he had not been prepared for, which was an unusual experience for someone who prepared for everything. He was on the north bank with the land forces, watching the green glow on the horizon where his ships were burning, and the quality of his silence in those minutes was different from his ordinary silence, heavier, more internal, the silence of a man recalculating at speed. Renly rode to him through the chaos of commanders seeking orders and soldiers looking north at the fire. He said nothing. He pulled his horse alongside his brothers and looked at the burning river and waited. "The fleet is gone," Stannis said. "Yes." "The river crossing is compromised." "Yes." "We still have the land approach, the mud gate, the King's Gate. The walls are strong, but our numbers are." Stannis stopped. His jaw worked. "We can still take this city." "We can," Renly said. Not encouragement, assessment. The wildfire was Tyrion's work. Stannis said it without inflection. "The imp. Almost certainly. He's good. He's very good." Stannis looked at his brother then, in the green-tinged darkness, with the burning river behind him and 100,000 soldiers looking to him for the decision that would define the next 10 years of Westerosi history. And something moved through his expression that was neither defeat nor determination, but something rarer and more honest. The acknowledgement of a man who respects difficulty, rather than pretending it doesn't exist. "We take the walls," Stannis said, "before Tywin arrives from the east. We have perhaps 8 hours." He turned to his commanders. "Sound the advance." The drums began. The greatest army in Westeros turned its face toward King's Landing's walls, and the Battle of the Blackwater entered its second phase. And in the Tower of the Hand, Tyrion Lannister, strapped on his mismatched armor and picked up his axe and went down to the gate because there was nothing else a man in his position could honorably do, and he was, whatever else he was, his father's son in this one specific way. He did not ask others to hold what he himself was not prepared to defend. The wall held through the night by the margin of 300 men, 2 locked gates, and one very small, very drunk, surprisingly ferocious dwarf who would never entirely remember what he did in those hours and whose soldiers would never entirely forget it. Tywin Lannister arrived at the Blackwater at dawn. His forces came through the Kingswood from the east with the particular quality of movement that distinguished armies under genuine commanders from armies under figureheads. No wasted motion, no gaps in the column, the cavalry screening the flanks with automatic precision, while the infantry moved at a pace that covered ground, without exhausting the men who would need to fight at the end of it. Tywin rode at the van, as he always did when the situation required it, and the sight of his forces emerging from the tree-line in the early gray light, golden lion banners catching the first sun, the ordered ranks stretching back into the Kingswood as far as the eye could follow, was the kind of sight that changed the mathematics of battles still in progress. Stannis' forces had been at the walls for 6 hours. They had taken the mud gate's outer defenses. They had not taken the gate itself, which had held through. The knight behind Tyrion's improvised command with a stubbornness that had less to do with the gate's construction than with the quality of the men Tyrion had positioned behind it, not the gold cloaks, whose loyalty was transactional and therefore unreliable under serious pressure, but the Lannister household guard, veterans of real campaigns who understood that the gate was the difference between a siege and a sack and behaved accordingly. The King's Gate had not been seriously threatened. Renly's cavalry had probed its approaches twice in the darkness, found them too well defended for a mounted assault against prepared positions, and pulled back to wait for daylight and the infantry support that the ground required. It was the correct tactical decision, and it had cost them time they did not have. When Tywin's trumpets sounded from the east, Stannis heard them from the mud gate's outer yard where he had personally taken command of the assault's forward elements. He stood very still for 3 seconds, the duration, Davos would later observe, of a man counting the cost of a decision already made and finding it exactly as expensive as he had calculated, and then turned to his commanders and said, "Sound the retreat. Orderly withdrawal to the south bank." Now, the retreat was, by the standards of military retreats, conducted under fire with a fresh enemy force, arriving on the flank, remarkably controlled. This was Renly's doing as much as Stannis's. He rode the withdrawal's exposed flank, with his knights in a rearguard action that gave the infantry the time it needed to disengage without turning an ordered retreat into a rout, absorbing the Lannister cavalry's pursuit with a series of controlled countercharges that were aggressive enough to be deterring and disciplined enough not to become isolated engagements that would have swallowed his horsemen piecemeal. Randyll Tarly's infantry was the last to cross the river. He crossed it on foot, personally, after every man under his command had made the south bank, and he did it without looking back at the city, which was the kind of gesture that soldiers remembered and retold for the rest of their lives. The army settled on the south bank in good order, battered but intact, and the arithmetic of the new situation assembled itself with the cold clarity of early morning light on water. They had lost the fleet. They had not taken the city. Tywin's Westerland's forces had changed the balance on the eastern flank. The wildfire had been used, expended, that particular weapon gone, and King's Landing's walls remained in Lannister hands. But the army itself was essentially whole. Stannis had perhaps lost 8,000 men in the night assault. His combined force still numbered close to 90,000, with the Tyrell grain supply intact and the Red Wine fleet, which had not been committed to the river assault, still operational. In Blackwater Bay, Tywin's arrival had changed the day's outcome. It had not changed the war. Stannis called his commanders to council before the sun was fully up. Tyrion sat in the Tower of the Hand Inn. Borrowed clothes, his armor, had been removed by 3 different people while he drifted in and out of consciousness. The slash across his face cleaned and bound by a maester whose hands had been shaking, and received reports with the mechanical attention of a man operating on the residual energy of crisis, because the alternative was to stop and feel what the night had cost. The slash was bad, not fatal, the maester had said, with the particular emphasis of medical professionals, reassuring patients about things that are true but incomplete, not fatal, but deep and permanent, and the kind of wound that changes a face into something that announces itself before the man wearing it has a chance to speak. Podrick hovered near the door with the anxious attentiveness of a squire who has survived his first real battle and not yet integrated the experience into something manageable. Bronn sat on the windowsill in the same position he had occupied before the battle, knife apparently resharpened, watching Tyrion with the expression of a man revising his assessment of someone he had previously underestimated. "Stannis is on the south bank," Varys said from the chair across the table. He had materialized sometime after dawn in the way he materialized everywhere, not arriving so much as becoming present. The transition from absence to presence happening in the gap between one moment's attention and the next. His forces are intact. He will not retreat further. No, Tyrion agreed. He won't. Your father is at the eastern gate. Joffrey has emerged from wherever he spent the night, not the walls, which the city's soldiers have noted with considerable feeling, and is prepared to claim the victory. Of course he is. The city is intact. The Mudgate's outer yard was briefly held by enemy forces, but is now reclaimed. Total casualties on the defending side are, Varys paused, significant. The assault force's casualties are larger. Tyrion was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, the city was beginning to make its morning sounds. The bells that rang for the dawn office. The carters and fishwives and bakers, who resumed their occupations, with the particular Westerosi urban resilience that treated catastrophe as an interruption rather than an ending. The Blackwater rush still had a faint green luminescence in the shallows. Near the north bank, where the wildfire had burned lowest, it would fade by noon. The sunken ships would not fade. They would be a navigational hazard in Blackwater Bay for the next generation, which some future maester would record as an interesting geographical footnote, in which the sailors who had to avoid them would describe in considerably less academic language. What does Stannis do now? Tyrion asked. He waits, Varys said. He is very good at waiting. And while he waits, he has options that the Night's outcome has not removed. He folded his soft hands. The Stormlands are largely his. The Reach is committed to him through the Tyrell Agreement. The Northern Lords are watching. Robb Stark's Raven arrived at Dragonstone 4 days ago. I have a copy, if you'd like to read it. Tyrion looked at him. Robb Stark made contact with Stannis. An exploratory communication. No terms of submission, but an acknowledgement that the North's independence and Stannis's kingship might be compatible positions, if appropriately discussed. Varys's expression was entirely neutral, which is to say that Robb Stark has just told Stannis he is open to a conversation, and Stannis has 4 months of supply on the South Bank and no reason whatsoever to hurry. The implications settled through Tyrion's exhausted mind like stones through deep water, each one landing with a distinct and irreversible weight. Stannis didn't need to take King's Landing by storm. He needed to make holding King's Landing more expensive than surrendering it, politically, economically, militarily, and then wait for the calculation to change inside the walls. The Tyrell grain supply meant his army ate while King's Landing's population began doing the arithmetic of a siege. The Red Wine Fleet meant nothing came into Blackwater Bay without Stannis's permission. Robb Stark's communication meant the Northern Front was a potential diplomatic solution, rather than a guaranteed second war. Stannis was settling in. He was going to starve them out. How long do we have? Tyrion asked. Before the city's grain supply becomes a political problem? 3 months, perhaps 4 with rationing. Varys paused. Before the small folk begin to understand what a prolonged siege means and translate that understanding into unrest? 6 weeks, I would estimate, optimistically. In my father's position? Your father, Varys said carefully, is currently receiving Joffrey's gratitude for arriving in time to save the city, which your father finds appropriate and which will not affect his strategic thinking in any direction. Lord Tywin understands the siege problem as clearly as you do. He will be looking for a solution that does not require him to fight a pitched battle against 90,000 men on open ground south of the city, which is a battle he would win, but at a cost he would find unacceptable. So everyone is looking for a way out that doesn't involve the next 6 months. Everyone intelligent, Varys agreed. The way out, when it came, arrived not through military calculation or political negotiation, but through Melisandre, which was either evidence of the Lord of Light's design or evidence that the Red Woman was the most consequential political actor in Westeros operating without a formal title, depending on your theology. She came to Stannis on the 3rd night of the South Bank encampment, when the army had settled into the rhythms of sustained siege preparation and the river between the two forces had resumed its ordinary appearance. The wildfire's green finally gone from the shallows. She came to his tent at midnight and found him awake, as she had known he would be, bent over correspondence, with the particular focused unhappiness of a man who has been separated from his objective by a distance he can measure precisely and cannot currently cross. The flames show me the city, she said. Stannis looked up. In the 3 weeks since Olenna's arrival at Dragonstone, their relationship had been altered by the letter, revelation into something more honest and considerably less comfortable. Stannis had said, in the brief, definitive way he addressed things he found necessary but unpleasant, that her independent communication with the Tyrell matriarch was not to be repeated, and Melisandre had acknowledged this with an equanimity that indicated she had expected exactly this response and considered it a reasonable price for the outcome achieved. "What does the city show you?" he asked. "Division," she said. "The lion and his cubs are not unified in purpose. The hand wants resolution. The father wants victory. The queen wants survival. The king," she paused. "The boy wants an audience. That is not a vision. That is a political assessment any competent observer could make." "The vision," Melisandre said, sitting across the camp table from him with her red robes pooling around her like banked fire, "is what lies beneath the division. There is a man in that city who wants what you want, your grace, not the throne. He has no interest in thrones. What he wants is for the truth to be acknowledged. The truth about Joffrey. The truth about the succession." She met his eyes steadily. "He has wanted this for a long time, and he is currently sitting in a tower trying to find a way to give you the city without burning it." Stannis was very still. "Tyrion Lannister. His interests and yours intersect at a specific point. He does not want Joffrey on the throne, not because of your claim, but because Joffrey will destroy everything his family has built through sheer capacity for catastrophic judgment. He does not want a siege that starves the city he has just defended. And he has," she stopped, looked into the small flame of the camp candle between them. "He has information about the succession, about proof, the kind of proof that, properly deployed in the right forum before the right witnesses, makes the question of storm and siege irrelevant." Stannis looked at her for a long moment. "You want me to negotiate with a Lannister? I want you to win," Melisandre said simply. "The Lord of Light does not specify the instruments." The candle flame moved, though there was no wind in the tent. Stannis watched it. Then he reached across the table and picked up a blank sheet of parchment and a quill and began to write. And the first word he wrote was not a greeting, but a statement of fact. Because Stannis Baratheon did not know how to begin letters any other way. "The city will fall. The question is only what survives the falling. If you are the man I am told you are, you already know this. SB." He folded it, sealed it with plain wax, no sigil, no identification beyond the handwriting, and handed it to Melisandre, who received it with the expression of someone completing a step in a process whose outcome she had already seen and found, on balance, acceptable. Outside the tent, the army breathed in its sleep. The river moved between the two forces in the dark, and somewhere in King's Landing's Tower of the Hand, a small man with a freshly scarred face sat awake in the small hours and waited, with the patience of someone who had learned that the most dangerous moves in any game were the ones that made perfect sense to both players simultaneously. The Raven arrived before dawn. Tyrion read the letter twice, which was once more than he needed and once less than his caution demanded, then held it over the candle until it caught and watched it burn down to his fingers before dropping the ash into the cup of wine he hadn't been drinking. Podrick watched this process from the doorway with the expression he reserved for his lord's behavior. That was clearly significant and entirely opaque. "Go to sleep, Pod," Tyrion said. "It's nearly dawn, my lord. Then go to sleep for the portion of the night that remains. Consider it a philosophical exercise in accepting incomplete outcomes." He waited until the door closed, then sat very still in the way he did when the thinking was serious enough to require stillness. Not the stillness of uncertainty, but the stillness of a man laying out the components of a problem with the careful precision of a maester, arranging surgical instruments before an operation he knows will be difficult and cannot afford to rush. The letter was from Stannis. This was not a guess. The handwriting had the quality of a man who had learned his letters from someone who insisted on correctness and had never developed the individual flourishes that came from writing freely, compressed, precise. Every letter formed as though it had been reviewed for accuracy before being committed. Tyrion had seen Stannis' signature on official documents twice in his life, and the compression was identical. More importantly, the sentence structure was Stannis's, not a greeting. not a diplomatic opening, simply a statement of fact delivered as though the writer considered social conventions a form of intellectual dishonesty he had decided not to participate in. The city will fall. The question is only what survives the falling. Tyrion appreciated this more than he would have expected. He was surrounded, perpetually, by people who said things they didn't mean in order to avoid saying things they did. And the experience of receiving a communication that skipped that entire layer of performance and went directly to the functional core was refreshing was the wrong word, clarifying, like cold water after too much wine. He had information about the succession. Stannis knew he had it. Stannis was telling him, in the compressed language of a man who didn't do subtext, that the information was the key that unlocked a door both of them needed opened. The question was what walking through that door cost a Lannister. He went to his father before the morning council. This was a decision that required more courage than the Mudgate had, because Tywin Lannister in a post-battle morning was at his most analytically precise, which was the version of his father that Tyrion found simultaneously most useful and most difficult to survive. Tywin was reviewing grain inventory reports when Tyrion entered, already past the battle's tactical assessment, already in the logistical reality that followed military outcomes, which was itself a form of intelligence. He looked up at his son's face and at the wound across it with the brief, assessing attention of a man cataloging damage, and said nothing about it, which was Tywin's version of acknowledgement. "You held the gate," Tywin said. "The gate held itself. I happened to be in front of it." "Don't do that," Tywin said, with the flat precision he used for statements that were instructions. Men who diminish their own competence invite others to agree with them. "You held the gate. Accept it." Tyrion sat down. This was unusual. He generally stood in his father's presence, a habit formed from the subconscious, understanding that height was a variable he could not control and therefore should not emphasize. Sitting made them nearly equal across the table, which was either symbolic or practical, and felt, this morning, like both. "I need to discuss the siege." "The siege," Tywin said, "will resolve itself within 3 months. Stannis cannot sustain 90,000 men on the South Bank, indefinitely regardless of the Tyrell grain supply. The Red Wine fleet is a complication but not a permanent one. I have ravens out to the Iron Bank regarding. He doesn't need to sustain them indefinitely," Tyrion said. "He needs to sustain them long enough for the city to become politically untenable, which is 6 weeks, perhaps 8. He paused. "And he has something we haven't accounted for in the military calculation." Tywin's eyes sharpened. "Explain." "Robb Stark's communication. If Stannis resolves the northern question through negotiation, grants the North its independence, removes the war on 2 fronts, he frees his strategic attention entirely for the South. No more worrying about his flank. No more dividing his ravens between the Blackwater and the Neck." Tyrion met his father's eyes. "And he has proof, father, or access to it. The question of Joffrey's parentage, the succession's legitimacy. If that proof reaches a great council, reaches the faith, reaches the lords who swore to Robert and have been pretending, the question doesn't exist." The silence was a specific kind, not the silence of a man who hasn't considered something, the silence of a man who has considered it and finds the territory uncomfortable and is deciding how much of that discomfort to allow visible. "The succession question is managed," Tywin said. "The succession question is suppressed," Tyrion said quietly. "Those are different things. Managed implies a solution. Suppressed implies a problem that continues to exist beneath the management." He watched his father's face. Stannis has Renly's voice now, the warm South behind him, the popular endorsement, the faces that small folk trust. And if he adds the legal argument, the proof that Joffrey is what he is, then he isn't just the cold claimant that lords reluctantly back. He's the only legitimate king left in the field, with the evidence to prove it and the army to enforce it. Tywin was very still. "What are you proposing?" he said, not conceding, not agreeing. But the question itself was its own acknowledgement. Tywin did not ask what you were proposing, unless he was prepared to evaluate the proposal seriously. Tyrion had thought about this moment for 3 days. He had run the conversation in his mind in every version he could construct, and the version that worked, the only version that worked, the one that extracted what was necessary without destroying what remained, required him to say the next thing, clearly and without the deflecting wit he used when he needed distance. From his own honesty, Joffrey steps aside, Tyrion said. Not publicly dethroned, not named bastard in a great council that humiliates the family in front of every lord in Westeros. A private arrangement. Joffrey abdicates in favor of Tommen, who is young enough that a regency council handles the actual governance, who is gentle enough that lords don't fear him, who is young enough that his parentage question is less, politically, acute. He paused. Stannis recognizes Tommen. Tommen's regency council includes Lannister representation, sufficient to protect family interests without constituting control. Stannis takes the credit for resolving the succession crisis without bloodshed. The Tyrells get their permanent court positions. The North gets its independence negotiation. The city doesn't get starved. The silence stretched to a duration that Tyrion had learned, over a lifetime of reading his father's pauses, meant genuine consideration rather than dismissal. You've been in contact with Stannis, Tywin said. I've been thinking about the problem. You've been in contact with Stannis, Tywin repeated, with the precise inflection of a man restating a conclusion he has reached independently and is confirming rather than accusing. Tyrion said nothing. Tywin looked at him for a long moment with the expression that was his version of complex emotion, no warmth, nothing as readable as feeling, but a quality of attention that was different from his ordinary assessment, something that acknowledged the man across the table rather than simply the problem he represented. If Cersei discovers this conversation before the arrangement is finalized, he said, she will burn the city herself before she allows it. I know. Joffrey will not accept abdication willingly. Joffrey will accept what he's told to accept, in the right circumstances, by the right people. Tyrion met his father's eyes. That's your part of this. Another silence, longer than the first. The arrangement, Tywin said finally, would require ironclad guarantees on the Regency Council's composition, Lannister representation sufficient to protect the family's position for Tommen's minority, the Casterly Rock succession unaffected, the family's honor, such as Stannis would acknowledge it, preserved publicly. Stannis' interest is the succession corrected and the city intact. Tyrion said, he has no interest in humiliating the family beyond what the political reality requires. He is not, he paused. He is not a cruel man. He is a precise one. Send your reply, Tywin said. He returned to his grain reports with the finality of a man closing one chapter and opening another. Keep it off the ravens. A personal messenger. Someone whose discretion you have reason to trust. Bronn, Tyrion said. Tywin looked up briefly. A Sellsword as diplomatic courier. A Sellsword as diplomatic courier, Tyrion confirmed. Stannis will find it appropriately honest. Bronn received his instructions with the expression of a man being handed a task that was simultaneously more dangerous and more interesting than his previous assignment, which was the expression he wore whenever life was offering him something worth getting out of bed for. Cross the river, Tyrion said. Find whoever Stannis sends to meet you. Deliver the letter. Wait for the response. Don't read either document. Can't read, Bronn said. You absolutely can read. I've seen you. Can't read diplomatic correspondence. Different skill set. Tyrion handed him the letter and a purse heavy enough to make the point about seriousness, without requiring elaboration. If you're taken, I'm not going to be taken. If you are, Tyrion. Bronn looked at him with the direct simplicity of a man who had survived every situation his life had produced through the application of competence rather than luck. I've crossed worse rivers on worse missions for worse men. I'll be back by nightfall. He was back by mid-afternoon. The response he carried was 3 sentences, in the same compressed handwriting as the first letter. The terms are acceptable in principle. The proof must be presented before a council of lords sufficient to satisfy the historical record. Send the woman who holds it. She knows who she is. SB. Tyrion read it twice. Then he sat very still with the letter in his hands and thought about his sister, who had been many things to him over the course of his life. Cruel, complicated, frightened, brilliant, self-destructive, and thought about what this moment cost her, about what it cost Jaime. who had given everything for a woman, and a family that were now being surgically reduced to manageable components by their own father and their despised brother. He thought about Joffrey, who was 17 and monstrous and had never been given the conditions to be anything else, and who would spend the rest of his life as a former king in a world that had decided his existence was a political inconvenience. He thought about what his father would say if he expressed any of this, and folded the letter carefully and went to find Varys. There was one person in King's Landing who held the proof Stannis needed, one person who had known the truth long enough to have gathered evidence sufficient to satisfy a council of lords, one person who had survived this long by being indispensable to every faction, simultaneously, who had in his soft hands the document that could end a siege without a stone from a catapult. Varys received Tyrion in his chambers with the expression of a man who had been waiting for this conversation for some time and had decided, on reflection, to be pleased that it had finally arrived. "You already know," Tyrion said. "I know many things," Varys agreed. "Which specific knowledge are we acknowledging?" "The proof, the documentation of Joffrey's parentage. Who holds it, where it is, what form it takes." Varys was quiet for a moment that contained, unusually for him, something that might have been genuine consideration rather than performance. Then he said, "The realm, my lord Hand. Above all else, the realm." "Yes," Tyrion said. "That's rather what I was thinking." Outside the window, across the river, 90,000 soldiers waited in the autumn cold for a decision that was being made not on a battlefield but in a tower, by two small men who between them held the key to a door that everyone else was too proud or too frightened or too invested in the current arrangement to open. Winter was coming. It was always coming. But today, at least, it might be coming toward a realm that had solved one of the problems that would have made surviving it impossible. The council assembled at the Dragon Pit. This was Tyrion's suggestion, accepted by Stannis through Bronn's second crossing, with the speed of a man recognizing a good idea without requiring it to have come from himself. The Dragon Pit was neutral, in the specific way that only ruined things could be neutral. It belonged to no current faction because it belonged to history. Its great dome opened to the sky where the dragons had broken it 300 years ago during the dance. Its interior a vast circular space of cracked stone and old ash where the Targaryen dragons had been kept and had diminished and had finally died. It sat on Rhaenys' hill above the city, accessible from both the Red Keep and the South Gate, and it had the additional quality that Tyrion valued above almost everything in a venue for a conversation of this magnitude. It was large enough that the people having the conversation could be clearly seen by witnesses without being clearly heard, and it was ruined enough that concealing additional witnesses in the galleries and broken chambers above the main floor was both obvious and expected, which meant everyone would bring their observers, and no one could object to anyone else's transparency as armor. Everyone watching everyone else watch. The lords who assembled on a cold morning 2 weeks after the Battle of the Blackwater were not comfortable in each other's proximity. They arranged themselves on the cracked stone floor of the Dragon Pit with the careful spatial awareness of cats in a room that contains insufficient territory, each delegation maintaining the precise distance from every other that communicated both independence and the absence of immediate hostile intent. Stannis arrived with Davos, Renly, Melisandre, Randyll Tarly, and Olenna Tyrell, the last of whom surveyed the Dragon Pit's interior with the expression she had worn at Dragonstone, in which Tyrion was beginning to identify as her standard response to architecture she found historically interesting but aesthetically wanting. Loras Tyrell stood at her shoulder in his new white Kingsguard cloak, which he wore with the self-conscious dignity of a man still integrating a significant identity change. Tywin arrived with Tyrion, Varys, Kevan Lannister, and 2 household knights whose function was ceremonial, and whose presence communicated that the Lannister patriarch had decided this meeting was formal enough to require the visual vocabulary of institutional power. He did not bring Cersei. This was the decision that had required the most difficult conversation Tyrion had witnessed in recent memory, a conversation conducted behind closed doors in the tower of the, and the previous evening, the sounds of which had reached the corridor in fragmentary form. His sister's voice, controlled and then not controlled. Tywin's voice, always controlled. And then a long silence that was worse than either. Cersei was in her chambers. She had agreed to nothing. She had also not, crucially, done anything to prevent the meeting, which in the particular grammar of Cersei, Lannister's consent was as close to acquiescence as the situation was going to produce. Sansa Stark was present. This had been Varys's arrangement, conducted with the quiet efficiency of a man moving a piece to a position it needed to occupy before the game's critical sequence began. She stood near the Lannister delegation with the careful stillness of a young woman who had learned that stillness was survival, and she looked at Stannis across the dragon pit's cracked floor with an expression that contained several years of King's Landing compressed into a single moment of complicated hope. Varys presented the proof. It was not dramatic, as these things went. There was no theatrical revelation, no unrolling of a single condemning document while trumpets sounded. It was instead a systematic presentation, the kind that maesters gave at the Citadel when defending a complex argument before skeptical peers, methodical, layered, each piece of evidence, building on the last with the cumulative weight of a structure designed to survive interrogation rather than impress an audience. The documentation had been assembled over years. Grand Maester Pycelle's own records, carefully extracted from the Citadel's copies before Pycelle could ensure their disappearance, records of Cersei's pregnancies, their timing, their attendant circumstances, testimony from 2 septas who had served in the Red Keep during Joffrey's birth, their accounts sealed and notarized, held in bravos at the Iron Bank in the manner of documents whose holders expected them to outlive any attempt at suppression. A genealogical analysis from a maester in Old Town, not Pycelle, someone without Lannister patronage, demonstrating the genetic inheritance patterns of Black Baratheon hair through 4 generations and their consistent dominance over other coloring in every recorded union. And finally, most concisely, a letter in Lisa Tully's own hand, retrieved from the Ares archives by a man whose name Varys declined to provide, describing what she had been told about Joffrey's parentage by Peter Baelish before her marriage to Jon Arryn, which itself explained why Jon Arryn had begun asking questions that had ultimately cost him his life. Grand Maester Pycelle, seated in the witnesses gallery and looking more comprehensively miserable than any human being Tyrion had recently observed, did not attempt to challenge the documentation. He had been shown it the previous evening by Tywin Lannister, personally, and had made the calculation, with the survival instinct that had kept him in his chain through 3 kings and 2 wars, that his role here was to authenticate rather than contest. The lords witnessed in silence. Stannis listened to the presentation with his eyes on Varys and his jaw doing its characteristic compression, and when it concluded, he said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, "The documentation is sufficient for the historical record," Davos said carefully, because Davos always said the thing that needed to be said when no one else was willing to say it. "And for the lords here assembled as witnesses, is it sufficient for a great council? A great council would take months to assemble and would become a political performance rather than a legal proceeding," Tyrion said. "The lords here assembled represent sufficient military and territorial authority to constitute a legitimate council of judgment under the precedents of Varys." "Which precedent are we using?" "The Council of 91, Varys said smoothly, "which determined the succession question following the Blackfire rebellions on the basis of assembled lordship rather than full Great Council attendance, on the grounds that the realm's immediate stability outweighed procedural completeness." "That precedent is disputed," Randyll Tarly said, from his position behind Stannis. "Not objection, information." Tarly dealt in facts the way other men dealt in courtesies. "Most useful precedents are," Tyrion agreed pleasantly. The terms had been negotiated through brawn over 4 crossings, each letter shorter than the last as the essential points were agreed and the peripheral ones discarded, until what remained was a document of 11 provisions that both sides had reduced to the minimum number of words required for legal clarity and the maximum number of words required for political face-saving, a balance that Tyrion considered one of the genuine arts of governance. Joffrey would abdicate in favor of his brother Tommen, framed publicly as a voluntary act of royal magnanimity, the king, choosing his younger brother's gentler temperament as better suited to the realm's current need for stability. The word bastard would not appear in any public document. The succession question would be recorded in sealed historical documents, accessible to maesters and future rulers, but not circulated in the realm's general political discourse during Tommen's minority. Stannis would recognize Tommen as king. This was the provision that had required the most letters, because it required Stannis to accept something that was technically not the outcome his legal claim demanded, and Stannis' relationship with technical accuracy was a religious one. What had moved him, what Tyrion had eventually understood was the key, was not the political pragmatism of the arrangement, but Davos's quiet observation, delivered in a private council, that Tyrion was not present for, but that Melisandre had subsequently described with her characteristic economy. "You wanted the record corrected, my lord. The record is corrected." Tommen's reign begins on the foundation of acknowledged truth, even if the truth is sealed. That is more than Joffrey's reign ever had. Stannis had sat with this for 2 days and then agreed. The Regency Council would include 2 Lannister members, Kevan and Tyrion, alongside 2 neutral appointments from the realm's broader lordship, Stannis' nominated representative and the Grand Maester, whoever that turned out to be after Pycelle's inevitable retirement. The hand of the king would be Tyrion Lannister for a minimum of 2 years, after which the position would be open to reappointment by the Regency Council. Stannis would retain command of the combined Baratheon-Tyrell military forces, his title as Lord of Dragonstone, and formal recognition as the realm's most senior military authority under the king, a position that made him, effectively, the realm's protector without requiring him to sit a throne he had been denied. The North would receive a negotiated settlement. This provision was deliberately vague, appropriate consideration of northern concerns regarding governance and sovereignty, to be formally addressed within 1 year of the Regency's establishment, because making it specific would have required Robb Stark to be present, and Robb Stark had not been present, and Tyrion had decided that a vague promise of good faith was more honest than a specific promise made without the relevant parties' participation. Renly would be Lord of Storm's End and the Stormlands, his formal titles restored, his military role as General of the South maintained. Under the new arrangements, military structure, this was the provision that had been easiest to write and hardest for Stannis to sign, not because of its content, but because of what signing it required him to acknowledge. That his brother had been right, that warmth was a political asset, and that acknowledging this in a legal document was the closest Stannis Baratheon would ever come to saying so out loud. The signing happened in the Dragon Pit Center, at a table brought in for the purpose, plain wood, no sigils, practical, with the cold autumn sky visible through the broken dome above them and the old ash of Targaryen, dragons beneath their feet. Tywin signed for the Lannister interest with the unhurried precision of a man who had decided the outcome served his family's long-term position and had therefore decided to execute it with full commitment, rather than reluctant compliance. Stannis signed with the forward lean of a man who had been waiting for this moment for years and was not going to let himself feel it properly yet, not until it was done. Renly signed last among the major parties, and he signed with the flourish. That was his natural handwriting rather than a performance, and when he sat down the quill he looked at his brother across the table and said quietly, in a voice meant only for Stannis, "Robert would have hated this." Stannis considered this for a moment. Robert hated everything that required patience, he said. He would have been drunk before the documentation was presented. He would have been drunk when he arrived. A pause, the smallest pause, barely a pause at all. He would have been relieved. Renly looked at him. Something passed between them that the Dragon Pit's old stones held with the same indifference. They had held dragon fire and centuries of wind. Yes, Renly said. He would have. Melisandre watched the signing from the gallery above, where the broken stone provided shadow enough for a woman in red to be present without being the ceremony's focus. She watched Stannis sign, and felt the Lord of Lights. Warmth move through her like a current, which was R'hllor's version of confirmation, not joy. The god did not traffic in joy, but the sense of alignment. That came when the present moment matched the shape of what the flames had shown. She looked north through the broken dome, past the city, past the Kingswood and the King's Road and the next dark waters, and the endless gray forest of the north, toward the wall's ancient ice and what lay beyond it. The political settlement below her was necessary. It was correct. It cleared the board of the distraction that had kept Westeros's military power fragmented and facing inward when it needed to be unified, and facing north. But it was not. She knew with the cold certainty of a woman who had looked into fire that did not lie. The ending. It was the preparation. The armies that had faced each other across the Blackwater Rush would need to turn. The swords that had been raised against Lannister Gold and Baratheon law would need to be pointed at something that did not negotiate, did not sign documents, did not care about regency, councils, or succession precedents, or the particular political architecture that humans built to manage their fear of each other. She had seen the wall in her flames for 3 nights running now, each vision longer than the last, each one colder. She pressed her hand against the warm brass bowl at her belt and felt the heat of it against her palm and said nothing to anyone, and watched Stannis rise from the signing table and begin the work of becoming what the Lord of Light had always intended him to be, not a king of ashes, but a king of the living, facing the dark. Below, in the dragon pit center, Tyrion Lannister caught Varys' eye across the signed document and raised an invisible cup in the manner of a man toasting something that had cost more than he had expected and was worth exactly what he had paid. Varys returned the gesture with the faint smile of a man who had been patient for a very long time and found patience, on the whole, to be the most reliable strategy available to people who couldn't afford armies. The realm had a king. The succession had its truth, sealed but recorded. The armies would stand down from the river and march to their respective quarters, and the small folk of King's Landing would resume their ordinary lives without entirely understanding how close the city had come to the alternative. And in the north, behind a wall of ice and ancient magic, 8,000 years of patient darkness waited with a stillness that made Stannis Baratheon's stillness look like agitation, and felt the warmth of human resolution moving like a distant fire through the cold, and began with the unhurried certainty of things that do not tire and do not feel and do not stop to move. The small council of King Tommen the first of his name, Lord of the 7 Kingdoms, protector of the realm, 8 years old and possessed of a kitten named Ser Pounce, who attended the first 3 regency sessions before Tyrion had him diplomatically relocated to the royal apartments, met for the first time on a morning of thin winter sun that came through the Red Keep's high windows at the flat angle that meant the season was genuinely turning. Tommen sat at the table's head with the careful posture of a boy who had been coached extensively and retained perhaps 60% of the coaching under the pressure of the actual event. He had his mother's eyes in his. Tyrion did not think father even internally anymore. It was a habit he had decided to break as a matter of intellectual honesty. His Baratheon coloring, such as it was, softened by Lannister refinement into something that was neither lion nor stag, but simply a boy, young and gentle and not yet ruined by the specific mechanisms that Westeros employed to ruin kings. Tyrion looked at him and felt something he rarely felt in council chambers, something adjacent to hope, and immediately suppressed it on the grounds that hope was a liability in a room full of people who were all simultaneously trying to protect Tommen and position themselves advantageously relative to his eventual majority. Kevin Lannister sat to the king's right, with the reliable solidity of a man who had spent his life being the competent Lannister that history forgot because he never did anything catastrophic enough to be memorable. Tyrion sat to the king's left, Stannis' representative, a lean, gray-eyed lord from the Stormlands named Godric Burrell, whose primary qualification appeared to be that Stannis trusted him completely and liked him not at all, which was Stannis' preferred combination in a delegate. Sat across from Kevin with the watchful neutrality of a man who understood his function was observational rather than interventionist unless Stannis's interests were directly engaged. The two neutral appointments were Lord Mathis Rowan of Golden Grove, whose reputation for administrative competence had survived 4 kings without serious damage, and Ser Barristan Selmy, recalled from wherever Joffrey's cruelty had driven him and reappointed to a council role that acknowledged his integrity without requiring him to serve a king he couldn't respect, an arrangement that Tyrion had constructed specifically because having Barristan Selmy in the room made every decision made in that room feel, if not automatically correct, then at least accountable to a standard of honor that the other members would find inconvenient to openly violate. Grand Maester Gorman Pycelle had retired 3 weeks after the Dragon Pit settlement with the relieved speed of a man who has been waiting for permission to stop, sat at the tables far in with fresh ink on his fingers and the alert attention of someone who understood that the historical record of the next several years would be shaped in significant part by what he wrote down and how he chose to describe it. The first order of business was the North. Robb Stark's envoy, not Robb himself, who remained in Riverrun managing the war's untidy aftermath, but Catelyn Tully, who arrived at King's Landing with the particular bearing of a woman who has survived things that should have destroyed her and has decided to use the survival rather than simply be grateful for it. Sat across from Tyrion in the small council chamber and laid out the North's position with a clarity that Tyrion found professionally admirable. The North wanted its independence formally recognized, not negotiated, not conditionally granted, not subject to review during Tommen's majority, recognized, in the language of the settlement document, as a permanent constitutional reality, the Kingdom of the North, sovereign within its borders, allied with the Iron Throne through treaty rather than subservience, contributing to the realm's collective defense in exchange for the realm's collective recognition of northern sovereignty. Tyrion had expected this. He had also expected that Godric Burrell would object on Stannis' behalf, since Stannis' legal mind did not naturally accommodate the concept of permanent constitutional reality when applied to a kingdom's sovereign claim over territory that had been part of the 7 kingdoms for 300 years. What he had not expected was that Burrell, after 3 days of private correspondence with Dragonstone that Gorman's ravens carried north with unusual frequency, returned to the chamber with a modified position that Stannis had apparently arrived at through the same ruthless analytical process he applied to everything. The North's military contribution to the defense against the threat beyond the wall is worth more than the symbolic assertion of unified sovereignty over a territory that effectively governs itself regardless of what the document says. Grant them the recognition. Get the swords. The formal language took another week to finalize. Catelyn witnessed the signing with the expression of a woman who had hoped for this for years, had nearly lost it to her son's honor and her husband's death, and was receiving it now in circumstances so different from what she had imagined that gratitude and grief arrived simultaneously and were indistinguishable from each other. She sent a raven to Robb that night. The message was 4 words. The North is free. Joffrey's departure from King's Landing was managed with the careful staging of an event that everyone involved needed to mean different things simultaneously. Publicly, it was a royal progress, the former king traveling to Casterly Rock to oversee Lannister interests during his brother's minority, a role of dignity and significance that the official announcement described in language so consistently positive that anyone paying attention would immediately understand it as the diplomatic vocabulary of managed removal. The small folk watched the procession from the city streets with the complex silence of people who had suffered under Joffrey's reign and were not sad to see him go and were not going to say so where the gold cloaks could hear. Joffrey himself had accepted the situation with a combination of outrage, genuine grief, and the particular bewilderment of a boy who has been told all his life that he is a king and has discovered that kingship is, in the end, a political arrangement rather than an immutable fact of nature. His outrage had been loudest in the first 3 days. His grief, for the throne, for the identity, for the version of himself that had worn the crown, had been quieter and, Tyrion thought, more real. He had seen his nephew, in the days before the departure, sitting in the royal apartments with Ser, pounce on his lap in the absent way of someone receiving comfort from a simple warmth, and had felt, uncomfortably, that there was a person somewhere, inside the cruelty, who might have become something else in different circumstances, and would not now have the chance to find out. He did not say this to anyone. It would not have been useful, and it would not have changed anything. And the understanding of tragedy did not require its articulation to be real. Cersei rode with the procession as far as the Kingswood's edge and then turned back. She had not spoken to Tyrion since the Dragon Pit. She had not spoken to Tywin in terms that contained any content beyond the minimum functional communication required by proximity. She had retreated into herself in the way that Cersei retreated, not collapsing, never collapsing, but contracting, pulling her power inward until it occupied a smaller but more concentrated space. And from that smaller space she watched and calculated and waited, with a patience that she had always had and had never before needed to deploy at full capacity against her own family. Tyrion watched her ride back through the Kingswood Gate and thought, she is not finished, not as a threat, not immediately, not overtly, but the woman who had built her entire identity around her son's kingship and had that identity surgically removed was not the woman who would spend the next decade in quiet acceptance of the new arrangement. She would adapt. She would find a different lever. She was, whatever else she was, her father's daughter. He filed this observation in the part of his mind he reserved for problems that required monitoring rather than immediate action, and turned back to the city. Stannis returned to Dragonstone after the settlement's first month, which was where he preferred to be and where his presence was most useful, managing the combined military forces, overseeing the Northern Treaty's implementation, conducting the correspondence with the Wall's new Lord Commander that had become, in recent weeks, unexpectedly urgent. The letters from Castle Black had started arriving in late autumn. They came from Jon Snow, not yet Lord Commander, but acting commander in the aftermath of events that the Night's Watch's ravens described with the controlled understatement of men trained to report facts without appearing to panic, which had the paradoxical effect of making the facts considerably more alarming than panic description would have achieved. The wildlings were moving south in numbers that had no precedent in living memory, not raiding, moving entire clans, with their families, their animals, their possessions, everything they could carry and some things they couldn't, pressing against the wall, with the focused desperation of people, running from something rather than toward anything. Mance Rayder, the king beyond the wall, had sent 3 ravens in 4 weeks, each one shorter and more direct than the last. The third was 11 words. Open the gate. What follows us does not care about your wall. Stannis read it in his solar at Dragonstone on a night of early winter cold that came through the volcanic stone despite the fire, and thought about the vision Melisandre had described, the blue eyes, the numbers, the night that did not end, and set the raven down and called for Davos. Send to Castle Black, he said. Tell them we're coming. Davos looked at him. The army just stood down from the Blackwater. The army stood down from the Blackwater to rest, Stannis said, with the precision of a man correcting a misunderstanding before it becomes a misapprehension. It did not stand down from its purpose. Renly heard about the Northern Ravens 3 days after Stannis. He was at Storm's End, relearning the rhythms of lordship after the fever of the campaign, the grain counts and the harvest reports and the small disputes between small folk that made up the actual texture of governing, rather than its dramatic mythology. When the Raven from Dragonstone arrived with Stannis' summary of the walls, communications, and a single additional line that Stannis had added at the letter's end, below the official summary, in a handwriting that was the same compressed precision as always, but which Renly read 3 times, because the content was so unlike anything his brother had previously committed to parchment that he wanted to be certain he was reading it correctly. You were right that numbers matter more than arguments. I need the South's swords pointed north. Come to Dragonstone when you can. Not an order, not even, technically, a request. A statement of fact and an invitation, offered by a man for whom both were forms of communication so vulnerable to misinterpretation that deploying them required a degree of trust that Stannis Baratheon extended to approximately no one without significant prior evidence of its justification. Renly sat with the letter in the great hall of storms, end with the sound of the sea outside and the fire in the hearth, and Brienne standing at the door in the reliable way she stood everywhere, and read his brother's words again, and felt something that he had not let himself feel since the morning on Shipbreaker Bay when they had clasped hands across gray water. He felt, quietly and without performance, that they might actually do this. Melisandre stood at Dragonstone's highest parapet on the first night of true winter and looked north across the black sea and felt the cold coming from a direction that had nothing to do with weather. The Lord of Light's fire burned in her brass bowl at her belt, and the flames moved in the way they moved when they were showing her something she had not asked to see, and she looked into them with the focused attention of a woman who had learned that the difference between vision and warning was entirely a matter of how much time you had left to act on the information. She saw the wall. She had been seeing the wall for weeks now, each vision longer and more specific. The ice, the wards, the ancient magic that had held for 8,000 years and was being tested now in ways that the men who built it had anticipated, and the men who currently manned it had never been trained to face. She saw the army that was coming, not an army in any human sense, not the arranged columns and supply lines and command structures that human warfare had evolved over millennia to manage organized violence. Something older and simpler and more absolute. The dead, moving with the patient indifference of things that had already paid the highest price and could not be deterred by the prospect of paying it again. She saw Stannis, distant, small against the scale of what was coming, but present, his banner on the wind, his face turned north, his sword drawn not for thrones or succession or the game that had consumed the past year, but for the only war that had ever actually mattered. She saw, briefly, something she had not seen before, a flash of the future that was less vision than impression, less image than feeling, a sense that the convergence of forces that had spent the year aligning themselves around a succession crisis had produced, almost accidentally, something more useful than any of its participants had intended. An army that was not divided, a realm that was not at war with itself, a collection of swords that was pointing, for the first time in years, in the same direction. She closed her hand around the brass bowl and felt its warmth against her palm like a heartbeat. Now, she said to the Lord of Light, in the silence of her own heart where theology and pragmatism occupied the same space. Now we are ready. Below her, in Dragonstone's harbor, the first ships of the combined fleet were already being restocked. Ravens flew north. Lords received their orders. The army that had resolved the South's political crisis with a signed document and a sealed truce was turning its face toward the cold, and the wall's ancient ice groaned in the darkness beyond the neck. And winter, the real winter, the one that the Starks had always known was coming and that everyone else had always managed to dismiss, until the moment it arrived, came south with the patience of something that had been waiting for 8,000 years and saw no reason now to hurry. The Game of Thrones was over. The real game had always been longer, colder, and considerably less interested in who sat on a chair made of swords. It was just beginning. What the Dragon Pit settlement produced was not the realm anyone had been fighting for. Stannis did not sit the Iron Throne. Renly did not wear a crown. The Tyrells did not get their queen. Tyrion did not get his father's respect, though he got something rarer, his father's acknowledgement, delivered once, briefly, in the form of a statement of fact rather than praise. You managed it. 3 words from Tywin Lannister that contained more than most men's speeches. What the settlement produced instead was a realm that was, for the first time in years, facing the same direction. The succession was resolved, imperfectly, with sealed truths and managed narratives rather than the full public reckoning that justice might have demanded, but resolved in the way that Westeros resolved things, through the machinery of political reality rather than the clean lines of moral clarity. Tommen sat the throne, gentle and young and not yet damaged, with enough competent hands around him to give him the chance his brother had never had. And in the north, the real war waited, the one that did not care about Lannister gold or Baratheon law or Tyrell, grain or the careful language of Regency documents. Stannis was going to the wall with every sword the unified realm could spare, and Renly was riding too, Dragonstone to stand beside a brother he had finally stopped competing with. And somewhere beyond the ice, the long night was measuring the distance south and finding it. At last, crossable. Winter had come, but for the first time in a long time, it was coming toward a realm that had remembered, just in time, what it was supposed to be defending. All men must die, but legends endure. More stories await.